Engravers, this is Justin here, and this is the first in a series on the beach romance, and this was the basis that we used for the June Engraving Challenge and Music Engraving Tips. I'm really excited to go through some of these scores. We had 23 submissions to this challenge, so I'm going to go through each one in a separate video and basically just give my feedback on, what was done well, what was could be improved, what things are house style considerations versus technical considerations, and basically it's a way for us to all see various approaches in engraving to the same piece of music, and that's something you don't see very often. You sometimes see that with publishers doing different editions of the same piece. But, in this particular instance, there's very little editorial stuff that gets in the way of that. So we'll be able to see basically how the engraver would approach this piece. And basically how this is going to work, I have PDFs in this window here, and I'm just going to be going through and marking them up, and then everyone who submitted, you will get a copy of the marked up PDF, and you can just have that if you want to review it on your own. But part of this is I'm going to talk through what's going on in terms of my feedback, which things were done well, which things could have been improved. Also, I want everyone to remember that I'm kind of approaching this from a publisher's point of view. So if this was to be published, on paper or digitally, doesn't really matter either way. But the point is the quality of the work should be high enough that you would expect to come from an actual publisher, a larger company that, has an editorial staff or an engraving staff, because that's my background. I worked for several years as an engraver at Carl Fisher, and I've also, had experience with other publishers, working with them, trying to adapt my work to their house style, that kind of thing. So I think it'd be very useful for people to get to see that perspective, because you don't see it very often. Anyway, what we have here is actually the original manuscript that was our source material. So this is the original edition of the Beach Romance. You can see it's got the big fancy cover on it as well. This is by Arthur P. Schmidt, which I believe was a company. He's kind of similar in style to Carl Fisher. He was a German immigrant who came to the States to make a publishing house. And there were many competing publishers in the early 20th century that were doing the sort of similar ideas. And we're going to look at this particular edition and see what it does well, what it doesn't do well, and also to think of what we would do differently if it was published today versus when it was published back then, which I believe this was, what does this copyright say? It's very small. 1893. So this was, almost 130 years ago, give or take. So, certain notational standards have changed a bit. And obviously some of that is to do with musicians expecting different things. Some of it has to do with computers instead of physical engraving on metal plates. There's a lot of things to think about. And I will be talking about the score, which has the piano, and the individual part, because those have different considerations. You always have to keep that in mind. So getting right into it, this one has both the score, the part and the score together, but most people who submitted didn't do that, which is probably preferable, just so it keeps things more organized. But let's assume that this is the first page of the piano score, right? So that's page 1. Then you have page 2, page 3. Notice the page numbers. You have page 3, which is on the right, page 4, page 5, and you can see I have it laid out in these spreads like this, which is how you would see it physically on a stand. And then you have the even on the left and the odd on the right. And this is very nicely laid out. It goes up to 9 pages. One thing to always think about for publishing in terms of paper printing is everything needs to be in a multiple of 4, because a single sheet of paper that is a 2-page spread like this has a front and a back, which means there's 4 pages printed on that one piece of paper. And then you fold it in half, and that creates 4 pages. And in this case, this goes up to 9 pages here. Well, the closest divisible by 4 is 8, right? So this would actually require a 3rd spread, which would bring it up to 12 pages. So that actually means that you would have 9, and then 10, 11, and 12 would all be blank. Now, in this day and age, that's not as big of a deal because paper is relatively cheap. But back in the day, publishers would try to avoid that as much as possible, especially on, I want to say value publishers, ones that were really intending to do mass-produced sheet music, because at scale, those blank pages really would add to the cost. So you always want to keep that in mind. So in this particular situation, it's a bit tricky to say why they didn't try to condense this a little bit more, but this is already pretty well balanced. But there's some spots here, especially like right in here. They probably could have gotten away with 3 measures per system. Hard to say. And obviously a part of it is that they're using a very generous staff size, and I'll get to that in just a minute. So the piano part, that goes, and it also starts on a page 2, which is really convenient. So you see more music all at once. There's no need for an extra page for the preface. Obviously, that's one of the tricks that's been done in publishing before. If your actual total music comes up to, say, 7 pages, and you need to put that cover page on there, well, there's your 8 pages. Sometimes if your total pages is one under a list, it would be 1 page less than one of those multiples of 4, then you just remove that extra page, which would usually be page 2. All things being equal, it's more standard to have the first page of music be on the page 3, because that is a right-hand page. Anyway, all that aside, I'm just talking about generically what's going on with, just generic layout things. So here is the violin part. We have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 on this one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 on this page, which is totally within the reasonable bounds. Usually the top level you would want is 12 staves per page. 10 is a really nice number because it allows you to get quite a lot of music on one page. And still, it's rather efficient that way. For the most part, it's pretty consistent. You'll notice on this second page here, on page 3, the staff spacing is completely consistent, which is very pleasing to look at. Over here, it's less so. And that's really just because there's a couple of spots here where the violin part gets really high and it starts to collide into the other staff. So you can see in particular here, this is a little bit of a tricky one. I'm not sure why this particular distance is shorter than the rest of them. Maybe it was just to save space or to give more space to the top, the title materials and all that. And this one obviously here is larger because the compassione is totally going to be in the way, which actually belongs to the upper staff. So this is really pushing it. You also see some things like this, where the piano is actually living in the staff. That's not as... the practice has kind of fallen out of favor in recent years. It has its place when things get really tight, but this isn't the tightest. But we'll talk about this in a minute, the way they do tempos here. Just a couple other things to point out. It's using the old-fashioned multi-rests, which you still see very occasionally today, but I wouldn't do that anymore. It's more typical to see the larger multi-rests. Let me see if I can draw this. They kind of look like this. And I'm just going to comment on a few quick things that you're going to see here, but you don't usually see in a modern edition. All these periods or full stops after all these pieces of data that you're seeing here. It's kind of hard to do with the mouse. Those would not be done anymore. That's an old-fashioned thing. And I'm doing, this is a proofreading mark. If you don't know this mark, what I'm doing here is I'm circling and then doing a little twirl, which means remove. It's a remove mark. Also, one thing that's not the most obvious, but this practice, Mrs. H.H.A. Beach, which I'm assuming is her husband, that's not done anymore, ever. That whole thing with the patriarchal name or whatever, that's not done ever. Let's talk about the music itself for a bit. So there's a few things that really stick out. It's the one I'm going to mention a lot in this piece because it's a very important motif. It is this thing. Let me use my little laser pointer, which is a really cool little feature in this program. So I can just show you like that. So you have these 3/8 notes that are in quick succession, and they almost always start on the and of 1. And of 1, 2, and of 2. And the problem with that is it's very easy to be mistaken for a triplet. And you'll see that further into the piece, you get a lot of triplets mixed in with this motif. So it's a really good example of a piece of music where you really want that distinction to be crystal clear. So this practice, which really derives from the practice of having 4 eighths all in a row, right? So if you did something like that, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you just knock off the first one. You see this all the time. The most famous piece of classical music in the world, Beethoven's Symphony No. 5, it does the similar idea. So, it's not like it's an uncommon figure, but it gets really confusing once this thing starts to be shifted in different places in the bar. So a more modern practice is to break this, where you would have, I'm just going to use this as an example over here, where you would have a flag on this one, and then these two would be beamed that way. So same here, flag, beam, flag, beam, flag, beam. You can see it happens everywhere here. Other than that, the notation actually looks pretty great. You have this little upstem B here, which, some people get really uptight about that. I'm not that offended by it in this particular instance because the slur does really show the contour of the phrase really well. So if we really want to get nitpicky, some of these slur points are a little bit sloppy, but it's not like they're wrong. That's just nitpicking, They're not wrong in terms of content, and that could be degradation of the print as well. It's hard to say. Another thing I really want to talk about here is the splitting apart of dynamics and tempo into like two different planes. Basically, the tempos become all large, bold Roman text, as opposed to kind of having them mixed together with all the expressions. And you see a bit of that here. You can see here the onomato, which could be an expression, but it's more often used as a tempo. You can see here poco rit and then a tempo. Same idea, but they're in italics. And that's like an older fashioned way of doing tempo modifiers. You still see that today sometimes, but it depends on the house style. A lot of house styles have now reverted to having these markings as bold Roman type, just like here in the front first tempo. Looking at some of these rhythms, you can see we have some beaming things going on here that are a little bit weird. Here you have the eighth notes, and then it's tied to a dotted eighth plus a 16th. If you want to properly apply the two-level parsing rule, that beam should be broken, because the 16th level, which would be 2 levels above, which would be a quarter, only applies to this half of that beam. And again, this just comes from the thing we talked about right at the top here, where you're trying to beam all four together and then one of the notes just is shoved a bit to the side. So better not to do that. Instead, make it more consistent. So same here. And then here's one that's really interesting and really potentially confusing, where you have 2 eighths that are straight eighths here and then an eighth triplet. Again, typical practice is that you would break that, because those are two distinct entities. And then the eighth note triple would actually get written on the beam side as a result. This doesn't need the beams like this. That's not necessary because you already have the eighth note beam. So get rid of those. And then obviously this would get removed because it's flipped to the beam side. This slur is kind of tricky, but that's more content based, and we might touch on that at another time. It's not really an engraving thing. There we go, same thing. This one's fine because it's just 4 eighths all in a row. The beam angle is a little bit steep, but it's okay. I think that's perfectly fine. This is all good. There's questions, obviously, of dynamic markings on whether you're going to do a poco diminuendo, or you do that as a literal diminuendo mark. You know, that's a house style decision. Then let's go down here. Here you can see there's those old multi-rests again. Definitely would avoid those. This is a very nice example of splitting the middle of the bar right here. All very well done. Some of these dynamics are a little bit wonky. You can see them kind of jumping around a little bit, and I think that's mostly because of the engraving medium. You know, this was done probably on metal plates, and these were probably punches. You can see some of these dynamics aren't the best aligned. Not sure why that is. It's a little strange. Here we got another 3 eighths in a row. I'm not going to mark them all because we're going to be here all day if we do it that way. Same motif here, except here now that we're using an octava. This is like one of the most popular ways of doing an octava, just the 8 with no VA. Totally fine. That's a house style question. This is really nice. They properly beamed all this together. That beam angle's really extreme. This one right here. Really extreme. Not the worst thing in the world. This right here is an interesting thing, because this is very similar to what happened up here, just doubled, right? So you have 4/16 all in a row. Usually you actually see this as it's written here. Um, but it's totally legitimate to also see it. Let me see if I can draw this. It's also totally legitimate to do something like this. One beam, two, two, and three. And then there's a dot on that. Sorry. I got that wrong. The dot's on this one. Something like that, where the 16ths actually divide, because then that respects the two-level rule. And I'm not sure why there's an inconsistency there just in general practice. I think it's just because it's so common to see 4/16ths in a row like that. But doing it this way or this way, I think both would be understood just fine. You see this one here. Più tranquillo. I mean, is that really a tempo or is that an expression? It's not clear. Could be either way. But having this, like, using this E here and smashing the dynamic and the tempo and or expression into one expression is not done very often anymore. Especially since this is essentially a one-bar diminuendo down to this piano. So, what it really should be is something like that. With a P there. Let's keep going. Molto espressivo. Here's that same issue there. Here's that same issue we had before. That makes that triplet a bit clearer. Same issue there. Alright, let's go to the next page. There's only 2 pages on this part, so it's really nice and dense and efficient. Alright, so now you're going to see here, we're seeing a lot more of that triplet and 8th note motif. Right? There's the triples there. That one can stay together. That's fine. So then here, so then here is where things get a little wonky. In this particular edition, it's, very firmly rooted in the 19th century way of thinking, where once triplets start, you don't really have to continue marking them because they were so common. It's a very common thing in that era. So you see right here, you've got the one triplet, and then the next 2 actually aren't even marked. There isn't even a simile. So you would actually want to mark those, especially since it only happens 3 times. I'm not sure why they didn't just bother to mark that. But again, 19th century. Another octava here. This is actually a little tricky one. That one right there. That should probably be marked as just a dotted quarter. Not sure why they didn't do that. Same here. And the 8ths here would definitely be tied as they are. Sol D, Sol G, that's all good. Again, the dynamics are a bit wonky here. See how they're not really aligned well. There's that old multi-rest again. I probably wouldn't keep that one there. It's not telling you anything that you don't already know by looking at it. I think one minor criticism I would have of this layout is I would put the break right there. I think that's the symbol. So that this particular little phrase is together. You've got the room here. You might as well do it. And then now we're back to the material that's pretty much at the beginning. So we have the same thing with the 3/8, breaking the beams here. This is a little subtle thing with the trill here. So they use a single trill for all these different notes. That's not ideal practice. I think it'd be much better if you did a trill for each note, because it does indicate... Ooh, this is hard to draw with the mouse. Trill, trill, trill. Because it does indicate that each note changes. It just makes it more obvious. Especially this one. This one would be easy to miss with the sharp. Also, because this piece is very tonal, there isn't really any need for accidentals or anything to show which note you're trilling to. I think it'd be obvious because it's just part of the key signature. Here's one that definitely needs to be broken. You can see that there. The 3 actually applies to these last 3. So that could get really messy. That slur, I'm not sure why that doesn't go all the way over. Also, this one's missing a slur. I'm just going to guess. I don't know that for a fact. We might want to investigate that. Same thing here. This one is probably supposed to be all the way across. Break that beam. Ooh, this one's interesting here. So they did break it here because they knew they couldn't get away with it, I guess. But yeah, this triplet has the dot inside the triplet. So that would be the best way to write that, for sure. And then this one way at the end. Now, whether you use an 8 here or not is an interesting question, because there's constant debate about this a lot of the time, where the 8s or the octava lines are not supposed to be used in in violin parts, essentially. I mean, I get it for this piece, especially in this particular passage right here. This gets really way up there. It's up in the stratosphere. Does this whole passage need to be under an 8? Probably not. I could definitely see just having it starting right here, and just this little phrase right there being as part of the 8. But, different strokes for different folks, I guess. Also, one really minor note right here. Those should be 2 beams. There's been some standardization of that over the years, where multiple grace notes should always be 16ths, while singles should always be 8ths. And there was a lot of inconsistency in the 19th century of that stuff. Yeah, I think that's all I got to say about the part. Now let's have a look at the piano part. So, one more thing. I do want to measure what's going on here. I've got a little measuring tool, which is very handy. 7 millimeters. So this particular part, it is 9 by 12, because 9 by 12 has been standard for a very long time, and this is all done with 7 millimeter staff size. And if you go down to the piano part here, you will see it's the same. We have 7 millimeter staff height in the piano part itself, and then the violin part is smaller, which is about 5 millimeter. It's between 4 and 5. It depends on. Yeah, 5 is probably the most accurate. So, piano part. This is done in, what we would call the standard way, where you have the violin part, which is the solo instrument, in small staff size. Piano part is in the large staff size, because that's what they're primarily reading. There's differences for vocal scores. Usually vocal scores actually has the singer's part at the same size as the piano, mostly because the pianist may have to read the vocal part more often. Usually with instrumental music, that's not a problem. And you see the instrument on the left in the margin. That's very standard. Usually it's not all caps anymore. You don't usually see all caps like that in more modern editions. So the main thing to look at with this piano part is, it's very well laid out in terms of density. I think that's a huge plus in this particular engraving. So, if you just kind of look at it from a distance, I'm quite far away here. I'm looking at entire spreads. There's not really any spots that jump out as having lots of white space or having, overly dense spots. If I was to get picky about it, this right there is a bit of a white space, but also keep in mind that this first page only has 4 systems. You'll notice that this one has 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, while the others all have 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Consistently throughout. Also, it's very interesting how well they're able to fit all of this music onto here while still keeping the larger staff size. I think that's a really, it's a really good example of showing how to be efficient with your space. There's a lot of music packed into these 9 pages. One thing I didn't talk about up top here, because I didn't notice it until just now, but this is important, is to always include measure numbers. That was a common thing, back in the day when measure numbers weren't, as standardized, but you should always have your measure numbers on the top left of every system. Because that's how the pianist and the violinist will communicate as a roadmap type thing. Obviously, they can communicate, on your high A, start there, but, which one? It's much easier to do it by measure numbers, so definitely always put measure numbers. That's a very 19th century thing about this edition. So, a lot of the problems of the part, or a lot of the differences, I should say, not necessarily problems, but differences, are kind of just more of the same, just lots more in number, right? So, you can see right at the top here, there's that same 8th note motif. Happens right here. Now this one right here is actually a bit of a concern. That dotted quarter note is crossing over the middle of the bar. So you would probably want to write it. I need to erase what I did here. You would probably want to write this as quarter, tied, and then this would actually be 4/8 altogether. And you got to be really careful in this piece with all the syncopations everywhere, that everything all adds up. It's really easy to make mistakes here. And we have one right here. Same deal. Quarter, tied. Except here, these ones would be separated, because they are 2 different halves. Then you have syncopations across the bar. Again, this is one that's debatable. So this particular note, that particular note, this one, you can either split them or not if you want to get really picky about splitting your syncopations across the middle of the bar. In this particular case, I don't think it's terribly offensive because it is a consistent syncopated pattern. Certain ones like this one are less good, especially because there's a clef change in the middle of the whole thing. I probably might even move this clef change to the beginning of this measure, right here. This piece also sometimes has inconsistencies, like why bother with this low A 8th rest, or the 8th note, and the low F sharp, when you could just do an 8th rest right here, and it would be the same music, because you've already doubled the bass part. The only thing I can think of is they're trying to be all Chopin-like with trying to connect the accompaniment with phrases and stuff, which it does happen occasionally, but for the most part, this feels really fussy. I'm not sure why they did this way. I would take those out. It's kind of messy, but you get what I mean. Same with this one. And if you really want to show this slur, you could slur over top from the bottom and slur the whole thing. Alright, let's keep going here. Actually, have to go to this page because this page is next. You see what we're dealing with pedals. Yeah, so the pedals are the older star notation. That's fine. You don't see it as often anymore because the lines tend to be more precise. And, you know, if you're going to do pedal markings, be sure you absolutely know what you're doing, because most pianists will just ignore them if they're not sensible. And you can see here, you know, they did 3 measures of pedal for the whole bar because that's the harmonic rhythm of this piece. Basically, the accompaniment is changing every bar. And then you see just here con pedale, which means, you know, just keep doing that. You're a pianist, you know what you're doing. Which is kind of nice. It's not riddling this whole piece with unnecessary pedal marks because the pianist knows what to do. They'll figure it out. Here we have that same 8th note thing. Same thing here. I'm not going to mark them all because we'll be here all day. Some of these syncopations get a little bit weird. I would probably break some of them. This one here, like, really emphasize that note on beat 3 with a divided syncopation there. This is all good. I'm going to assume that omission right there, that omission of the E is intentional, probably because it collides with the D here. It's meant to be like a D7 chord, so that's why they eliminated the E. So, but that pattern looks suspicious, but yeah, that's probably eliminated for that reason, so I don't have to worry about that. This I would probably write as 2 voices. This kind of figure. I mean, this just feels a little lazy when you could just do a half note B right there, and then you would do an additional, this is hard to do with a mouse, 8th or a quarter note and a quarter note, tie them like that. Same here, 2 voices, so that tied E is not necessary. It just becomes a whole note. Nice animato here. Some of the articulations are a little funny. Like, these should not be on top. I don't know why they are. That's another quirk of 19th century editions that you see sometimes, where the articulations aren't where you would expect them. They're kind of all over the place. This tie here is a little bit suspect when there's an articulation here. Put a question mark on that, I'm not sure. Yeah, and then this portato articulation in the piano. It's not like it's unprecedented. You see it a lot. So, and it's used a lot in this particular piece. Now, if you look here, this is quite interesting. Remember, we're only on page 2 of this. This is the first time we have triplets in the piano part, I think. I'm sorry, I skipped a page. That's why. I skipped this page because it goes from here and then down to here. Okay. So yeah, accents down below. It's just more of the same. There's more portato. Nice double voicing here. That clef change is a little bit awkward, but, you know, it's not terrible. Worse things have been done. This is kind of amusing here. This molto espress being shoved into the staff like that. That's pretty funny. You shouldn't need to do that. There's enough room there. So yeah, in this particular section right here, this is the first time you see triplets. These are supposed to be triplets, and they're not even marked. And, you know, part of that is, you know, it's the 19th century, it was so common, why bother type thing. You know, this is extremely right out of the pages of Chopin and Schumann and all those mid 19th century composers. So But, if we were doing this today, you gotta mark that. Gotta mark that. Definitely. And then once you get to this point here, the threes start getting pervasive, right? And you in this case over here, you would want to do something like that. You could probably get away with just this one measure and then just do sim. Whoop. Something like that. And it'll be understood, because this is a triplet all the way to the end. Even the rest here, that's good dedication to the triplet system. And then once you get here, it's very rudely brought out of it with the 16th rhythm. Alright, then we gotta go down here. This beam is in the wrong direction. I don't know why that is. Probably to keep it consistent with this one, but nah. The reason I say that it's wrong here is because the furthest extreme note should dictate which direction that the beam should go, which in this case, this low D sharp is actually further away from the middle line than the C. There's another one of those two voice sections. Probably would write that as a whole note. Same here. Okay, lots of chords going up, 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 up. And then we're way up here in the higher end. There's a simile, probably a good idea, because this portato gets a little annoying to look at after a while. But this whole thing is supposed to be portato. And a very good use of an octave line here, because pianists can read octave lines very easily. Okay, then we get down into here. Here they did actually mark the triplets. And obviously, that's I think that's mostly because of the context. We're coming off of a straight eighth pattern for many bars, and then all of a sudden it switches into this triplet mode. So it makes sense to mark it here. Probably would do an entire measure though. And like we did before, the 3 should go on the beam side. This one should have a bracket for that one. More triplet, triplet, triplet. And then right here, it stops being triplets. So what you could do is mark these here as triplets, or you mark everything as triplets. There's no easy answer there. Also, one thing that's really funny, remember that grace note? Here it is actually written as 16ths. So you can see there's definitely inconsistencies with how these grace notes are handled. This is a little suspect of using an 8 line here. I can see why they did it, because the spacing is tight. Because they're squishing 15 lines, staff lines on every page, you can't get up to that high A with the space you have here, not realistically. So I understand why they did it. It just looks a little awkward when you're this low in an octave line. That makes you, do a double take, wondering, well, why did you do that? Also, should this match here, where there's a F sharp tied over, which probably then shouldn't be an F sharp tied over, it should be a dotted quarter. Who knows? It's just going to get smeared in the pedal anyway, so it doesn't really matter. I don't know. I'm not one to say. This is interesting here where they're not doing multiple voices. I'm not sure why they didn't bother with that, because this would very clearly be pedaled to the half note to keep the harmonic rhythm going and keep that bass part sounding. So you could have very easily written these as half note in a second voice. More triplet, 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 triplet. And now we're on to the last spread. Triplet, 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 triplet. It's just endless triplets from here to the end of the piece. Lots and lots of triplets. Notice this right here. the swapping of the direction, that is totally correct. Because in this particular beat, the C dictates, while in this particular beat, the A dictates. So don't put them up just because that looks better. This is following the rules of how beams are supposed to go, which direction they're supposed to go. Same here. Totally same idea. Now, where this gets a little hairy with all these triplets here is right there. Because that is a full-length quarter note, while that is only a half or 2/3 of a beat. That's the two triplets. So I probably would do something like that. It's a bit hard to say. This is definitely drawing inspiration from composers like Schumann. There's that one piece in particular of his, I can't remember the exact name of it, but it's a cello and piano piece where one of the movements is just constant triplets over and over again. And it's very common to have these little counter melodies in the treble. Sometimes it's even in the bass. But instead of writing these as triplets, he actually writes them in the more old-fashioned style of a dotted eighth to a 16th. And then they actually line up to the triplets. And the confusion with that, obviously, is just, is it meant to be lined up? Is it supposed to be separated out so that you can hear it rhythmically different? Based on study and context, you know that it's meant to just be lined up and you fudge the rhythm until it works. But that's not always easy. Sometimes that's not always clear. So in this particular case, at least this particular edition is being more consistent with actually having these notated as triplets. So it's good to know that those notes are supposed to be exactly falling with the accompaniment. And just to put on my composer hat here, you can see this is the same motif as the very opening, right? So A, B, C sharp, F sharp. It's a different key at the very front, I think. Yeah, different key, but the point is it's the same motif, except here it's straight eighths, while at the end it's this triplet eighth figure. So it's a variation on the same idea. I think that's really, really clever little touch there. I like that, because then the pianist doesn't have to worry about doing some sort of weird 2 against 3 pattern. This just feels effortless as a result. The consequence, of course, the notation is a little bit awkward, but adding some brackets here and there helps with that. Obviously, the other option is doing 2 time signatures at once, where you would have this in 12/8 or something like that. But that was not at all common in the 19th century. Even in the 1890s, that would have been a pretty radical thing. So let's go on this last page here. And you can see it's just more of the same. You got lots of triplets, but then you also have the other voices now reverting back into the duple mode. So these 2 middle voices are in triplet mode, while the outers are full-length quarters. So that's not really marked anywhere that, oh, now we're back in duple mode. Really, because duple mode doesn't really ever assert itself for the rest of the piece. You're really in triplet mode the whole way through. Going all the way to the end, you're in triplets all the way. And, that's just it was a very conventional thing to do in the 19th century. Here again, we have inconsistent grace notes. See that there? Not great. This feels awkward. I kind of get why they did it, is they wanted the trill to be its own thing to show, the right hand is busy. It can't continue doing this other stuff. It's just a little bit awkward. I probably would, instead of doing this as a rest here, I probably would actually have this figure moved up here, right? And then just have a little, so let me actually write that. I'd have this figure moved up here, and then maybe have a little bracket or something that looks like that to say, oh, that particular figure is actually taken by the left hand. And you could really drive that home by having this bottom part a half note or something, but it doesn't really matter. Pedals there, it's going to handle it for you. And then here again, we've got the pedal markings being explicit. So we've got half note harmonic rhythm here, and then whole note. It just extends the harmonic rhythm, and then right to the end. All is under one pedal, which is really nice. It's a really delicate, lovely effect. And I think the notation of this is all great. I think it's absolutely clear. The only thing I can think of that I would change here is maybe that clef change, put it at the beginning of that beat. I'm not sure why they didn't do that. So it seems a little bit of a missed opportunity. And really nice use of the 8 here, because you don't have room at all. You know, same with all these. The 8 here. This is a little bit weird to be this low on an 8, but it's not the end of the world. Totally readable. So yeah, I think that's all we have to say on this one. So yeah, this is the Beach Romance. You can see there's not much red really that I marked up, because it's well done. It's a really well done edition, and most of the things that I would have changed are simply because we are 130 years later. Very little of this has to do with like the fundamentals of engraving or the fundamentals of notation. Most of this is just little things. So that's the end of this particular session, and I'm really excited to see all these other editions that have been submitted, and we'll see how that works out. And I hope you can join me as I make all those videos. I will do my best to get them up in a timely manner, but my time has been very limited given all of the other work that I'm doing with other projects, and just because there's a pandemic on and we're all stuck at home doesn't mean we're not working. Oh man, it's a crazy time. Anyway, I will see you in the next one.